So today we're going to talk about more on this question of who am I, about human nature, about what it means to be a human, what's the reality of human nature, who am I really, those sorts of questions we looked at yesterday in regards to Buddhism and Hinduism. Today we're going to look at a couple different approaches to that concerning the question of, first of all, society and the role that plays in determining who we are, whether that is a helpful role or a negative role. And the second thing we're going to look at is Karl Marx and his ideas that in our work, that can help determine our identity, the way we work, the sort of jobs we have, and whether that's sometimes positive and whether that's negative. All right, so to start, we're going to look at some ideas from a philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Put his name on the board behind me. Rousseau, R-O-U-S-S-E-A-U, was a French philosopher who talked a lot about human nature. What does it mean to be a human being? With Rousseau, it's very important to bear in mind that he looked at humans through what he called the state of nature. What is it like for humans to exist? What were we like prior to any society, any culture, any civilization? Okay? So that's the second term I'm going to write down, state of nature. So the state of nature is the manner in which human beings existed prior to any sort of society and any sort of civilization. In this state of nature, Rousseau says that human beings are very much like animals. One example he talks about is how a human being in this state would go about his daily existence. He would try to find some water to drink, try to find some food to eat, maybe some berries or some nuts or some acorns that fell from an oak tree. And then maybe underneath that same oak tree he'd find shelter for the night. And Rousseau contends that this person would be pretty satisfied doing that meeting these basic fundamental needs of existence would be adequate for the person. So if you've ever been camping or spent time out in the woods and you've had a slower pace life out there, Rousseau thinks that's similar to what it's like in the state of nature. Of course, let's be clear, it's different. It's different than you have a tent, you have a map, you have all that other equipment, none of which you would have in the state of nature. But this fact of being out in the woods, trying to just meet needs of shelter, water, food, and having that sort of slow, deliberate pace to your life, Rousseau contends that's very much what we were like in the state of nature. Now you watch animals, you watch stuff on the Discovery Channel or Smithsonian or wherever it is, a lot of times what they do is oriented toward finding food, finding shelter, and finding water. And that's a big part of what they do. So there's a struggle to survive, and they've developed capacities, strength, speed, cunning, agility, heightened sense of smell, heightened other awarenesses that allow them to basically survive well in their environment. So they've evolved to be able to meet their basic needs and face various threats. And they have an enormous amount of, like I said earlier, strength, agility, quickness, etc. So what Rousseau is saying is that human beings in this state of nature, human beings as we naturally are, without prior to society, without civilization, we would have a greater degree of strength, quickness, agility. We'd have a natural toughness. We'd have the ability to heal ourselves more readily. And we would adapt to living in this sort of society. Now, one example that people have looked at that might be relevant to this discussion is the example of feral children. That's another term I'll learn in the board. You may find it's interesting to look up. Now, essentially, these cases with feral children, F-E-R-A-L, children, feral children, are when, for whatever reason, kids seem to have been abandoned in the woods and yet learned how to survive there. And they've developed the capacity to eat raw meat. They've developed the capacity to stay out in very cold temperatures. They've developed the ability to heal quickly from wounds. And so one question that, one thing that people have looked at is to say, well, are these feral children like what Rousseau's talking about, the state of nature? Is this one kind of contemporary example that we see for this idea of living in the state of nature? And so that might be something that you find interesting to look up. How do humans, as the feral children, basically revert back to a more primordial way of being human, a basic way of being human? If you think about a dog, for example, dogs are basically, in a sense, a domesticated wolf. If you were to put a dog back into the woods for a long time, would it revert back to being like a wolf? Would it join a pack? Would it try to be an alpha? Would it start to hunt? Would it eat meat again, raw meat again? Would it learn to howl? Those sort of things. And Rousseau is saying, in a sense, like the human being as we live now are like domesticated animals. And before we got domesticated, we lived like a wolf. We lived like an animal. All right, now I want to clarify one thing, that there is a part of us, says Rousseau, that's much different from any animal. And this is our degree, our capacity for compassion. Another term I'll break down. So, humans naturally, says Rousseau, have this ability to be compassionate, to feel pity for other animals, to not want to inflict undue harm on them, to desire to coexist peacefully to some extent with them. So it's not for Rousseau as if humans in our state of nature are just uber-aggressive, ultra-violent, trying to destroy. Basically, he says what we want is to live peacefully on our own, by ourselves, in the woods, and we feel compassion and pity, and we desire to help others. So we're not a hugely predatory species. We just want to, in a sense, do our own thing and be content with that. Okay, another thing I need to emphasize for Rousseau is that in our state of nature, what he thinks human beings naturally are like, we don't form any deep bonds with other human beings. So for Rousseau, somebody walking in the woods in the state of nature a man might come upon a female, and they would copulate and have intercourse, and then the man would just go on his way. He said there's a desire to reproduce, like with all animals, but that desire to reproduce doesn't lead to actual family units. What it does is it leads to intercourse, and he said the man would go on his way, the woman would give birth to the child, and raise him for her for a while, and eventually the child would leave too. He would learn how to survive on his own. So he thinks this is very similar to, in an animal situation where female animal gets impregnated, raises the child for a while, and the child goes on its way. So Rousseau has a very strong, what we would call, individualism. That might be another way. Individuality. The individual exists on his own, does his own thing, tries to survive, tries to be happy, has compassion, but he's not tied to or bound up in any larger context. He doesn't have to be part of a family. He doesn't have responsibilities in that way. He's, in a very deep and real sense, on his own. Therefore, I think another term I want to put out here is individual. Okay, so we have this situation with Rousseau where we have individuals living on their own in this state of nature in a sort of animal-like fashion, and Rousseau thinks that they're very content with meeting their basic needs, getting adequate sleep, getting adequate rest, finding someone to mate with occasionally, finding enough food, and having a comfortable enough shelter. So it's a very minimalist type of life he's offering, but he thinks this is what human beings are like in our very natural core. We don't need any extra clothing, we don't need any fancy houses, we don't need any fancy modes of transportation. What we're really like at our nature is to exist as compassionate, highly intelligent animals. That's what we're like. Now there's a fellow who lived in Alaska, his name is Richard Kronecki, and there's a documentary on him called One Man's Wilderness. And this is a guy who moved to Alaska about 40 years ago, and he decided to build himself a cabin, hunt for his own food, grow his own food, and basically be separate from all of society for almost every day of the year. I mean, occasionally somebody would come in and fly him supplies, but besides that, he lived pretty much alone. This story is called One Man's Wilderness, and it represents this idea that one person living in the wild can actually live a very content, peaceful, and happy life, a fulfilled life. This is what Rousseau is saying. Rousseau is saying, look, we belong in the wild. Right? That's where our nature is. You take a wild animal and you put him in the zoo, you destroy something essential to the animal. You make the animal less than what it could be. A lion in the zoo here in D.C. is very tame and mild and doesn't have the sort of power, roar, and capacity and freedom that a lion would have on the savannah. Rousseau is saying something similar, that when we become too domesticated and become too civilized, it's like putting us in a zoo cage. We lose those natural abilities, we lose that natural freedom, we lose that natural being at home in the woods, and we become kind of engaged in these zoos, analogously speaking. So Rousseau thinks that human beings live naturally like this for a long time. But eventually we started to form little units of society. People started to come together. And one of the things that started to happen with Rousseau is that we would form these little societies, and people started to need each other. So let me try to analyze this a bit more. originally, people were able to meet all their basic needs on their own. So you've got this guy out in the woods who's able to hunt, fish, collect food, find a shelter, do all of that by himself. But suppose he starts living with several other people, okay? And suppose they say, okay, you're a really good hunter, and your job is just to go out and hunt. So he just goes out and hunts, which means he doesn't have time to collect berries or nuts or any other kind of food. He doesn't have time to fish. He doesn't have time to work on the shelter. So he starts to have those other people do those tasks for him. His full-time job is to hunt. So he starts to need them just as much as they need him to hunt. Everybody starts to depend on each other. So there's that loss of that individual freedom and that individual capacity to take care of oneself. People rely on each other, and they're able to get a sense of security from this, but there's a loss of individual freedom. All right? So previously, the man living in the state of nature had no responsibilities and had absolute freedom as to where he lived and how he lived, who he made, and stuff like that. Now, that freedom is lessened because he needs other people, so you have to stay close to them. So his freedom of movement is less. Right? His freedom of what he can do is less because he's now designated as the hunter. His freedom of a mate is lessened because he's not going to be able to move around as much. He's going to be made with people in the area. And he has a bigger sense of responsibility for trying to take care of the people in this same community. So what we're seeing is that there's a corresponding decrease in freedom as there's an increase in this sense of security. The more they're trying to get security, the less freedom they have. Okay? So as the society becomes stronger and more people join together and assume different roles and they work cohesively, they establish a greater security. Okay, so this guy who's the hunter now has other people helping him do these things to stay alive. But as we said earlier, he loses some freedom. Okay? So this is the next thing we look at. Security. All right. Now, as people developed into this society, Rousseau said they started to adopt a way of looking at themselves, a way of valuing themselves, a way of getting a sense of who they are. And Rousseau called this, and I'm going to give you the French for it, amour propre. Alright, that's AMOUR hyphen PROPRE. Amour propre. So this would mean, in one sense, love of oneself. But what Rousseau says it means that we start to value ourselves according to how other people see us. We get a sense of who we are according to how other people respond to us. So, for example, let's go back to our hunter. If people acknowledge that he's a great hunter, if they praise him for his hunting ability, he gets lots of accolades for having fed the community this year. At that point, he starts to value himself. He starts to think, oh, I'm a great hunter. Why? Because people see me that way. So in that case, what is it? We call amour propre. His sense of himself is derived from how other people respond to him, how other people see him. Now, there's a point of contrast here that we should draw. And this is what Rousseau calls amour de soi. Right? AMOUR -DE-SOI. In French, this also means love of oneself. But this is importantly different from amour propre. In amour de soi, someone values himself just because of the way he sees himself. He's not looking for any external validation. He has an internal validation. He's not looking for anybody outside of himself to tell him who he is or how great he is or what he can do. He looks inwardly and acknowledges that about himself. He looks at his own experience, his own past, his own capacities, and he forms through that a sense of himself and an appreciation and value for himself. So in the amour propre, you look externally, you look outside for getting a sense of who you are. In the amour de soi, you look internally to find out who I am and how I'm valuable. What Rousseau says is that as society gets bigger and we become more entrenched in it, and more involved in it, and we need it more, rely on it more, we get our sense of ourselves and our value and our worth more from others. We develop more of this amour propre. We look externally for finding out who we are and why we are valuable. Eventually, says Rousseau, we kind of lose a sense of ourselves intrinsically. And we become almost totally reliant on having other people validate us in order to have any sense of ourselves and any sense of our worth. So he uses this pretty funny example, but I think one that's helpful. He says eventually it becomes the case that in these societies people start having festivals, get-togethers, stuff like that. And in this get-together at this party, what starts to become the case is that the people who are the best dancers get the most mates, so they get the most dance partners, people who are more willing to spend time with them. So something like dancing becomes very prized, very valuable. So what happens is that these men who previously wanted to go and explore woods and live in the wild themselves are now in society trying to become the best dancers so that they can win the most favor and give the best impression to potential mates. So they're getting their sense of who they are and why they're valuable from the way that they're seen according to their ability to dance. If they're good dancers, they're valuable. If they're not good dancers, they're not valuable. So this is an example of this amour propre, this getting one's sense of who one is based on how other people respond, how other people see him, how other people think about me. If other people think I'm a great dancer and I'm a good mate, my amour propre rises. If people think I'm bad at this, I'm not a good mate, they don't look favorably upon me, they don't have a good impression of me, then my amour propre increases. So here, the manner in which I am perceived determines the way I take myself to be, how I feel about myself, etc. Okay, so one other thing I kind of want to draw out here is the following. This issue of value. So, in the natural setting, before society, in the state of nature, what was valuable were things that could help one survive and live freely and live on one's own. Okay? So things obviously like shelter, things like an occasional mate, things like running water, those are valuable. A bearskin coat is very valuable because it'll keep you warm. Flexible wood that can be bent and made into a bow is very valuable. A tree that you can climb and make some sort of shelter in is very valuable. Lack of predators around you is very valuable because you can live peacefully. However, after the formation of society, people getting together, people meeting each other, there's a shift. There's a shift from thinking, okay, pliable wood, running water are valuable. Now what becomes valuable are things that allow me to be seen favorably by others. Things that make others have a good impression of me. Dressing well. Having fancy things. Having a good image. Being able to boss others. Being in charge. Eventually, when money becomes a thing, having a lot of money. So there's this drastic shift in what is valuable. In the state of nature, what is valuable is what immediately helps survival. In society, what becomes valuable are those things that help one's one's external source of one's validation. So, what helps one to be perceived well, what forms one's image, those things start to become valuable. Let's go back to our hunter. Obviously, prior to any society, he would have had an amour de soi. He would have loved himself in himself for whom he takes himself to be. He would have been strong. He would have had all this capacity to survive well in the wild. He would have been content with this minimalistic, peaceful existence in the woods. He would have been living as, Richard Bernanke talks about his one-man wilderness. But in society now, he starts to rely on other people. We saw he had the loss of his freedom. And now, he has a loss of his own identity and sense of validation. It doesn't arise from within him, it arises from an external source. It arises from how people see him, how people think about him. Okay? And as he starts to rely more on this society and look to it to meet a lot of his basic needs, he's going to look to it for a source of validation and a sense of identity. He begins to want to have a nicer things or a bigger home so that people will have a favorable impression. He doesn't spend as much time living out on the woods alone. He doesn't exercise all of his abilities of strength, of cunning, of agility. He starts to become domesticated, and he starts to lose some of those capacities. Okay? So, this is what Rousseau mentioned earlier, this domestication of human nature, the civilization where we take this natural ability to survive and thrive and be content in the woods, and that becomes lost as we join the civilized society. So we don't have the strength that we used to have. We don't have the ability to heal ourselves that we used to have. We become, as Rousseau says, we become kind of weak. We need doctors. We need medicine. And finally, as I said earlier, we become kind of obsessed with our image and the way that other people see us. And we lose touch with this basic primordial nature, this basic sense of like being content, alone, free in the woods. The movie and book Into the Wild about Chris McCandless illustrates very well the kind of point I'm trying to bring out here with this very briefly, in case you're not familiar with it, Chris McCandless was raised in Annandale, Virginia, so close by. His parents were upper middle class, but really wanted to be affluent, upper class people. They were very concerned about their image, about making their first million, about getting nice cars, about having a solid home in the suburbs, about living the American dream, as it were. And Chris found all of this very stifling. He found it very much a limitation on his freedom and his natural desires. So eventually he left after he turned 22, graduated from college, and he wandered around the West for 2 years. He lived in the woods sometimes, he lived in cities sometimes, he lived on his own, he hitchhiked, begged for food, worked various jobs, and he wanted to free himself from what he took to be the burden of living a normal suburban life, trying to follow through with the demands of being part of that middle-class family. Eventually, he made his way to Alaska and lived for 3-4 months in Boston, in the Alaskan wilderness, completely alone and completely surviving, talking about how he had lived a good life there. So, again, as I said earlier with One Man's Wilderness, this is another thing to look up, is Chris McCandless. Shows this tension where we have this human nature wanting to be in the woods, of wanting to be free, of wanting to be on our own and have our amour de joie. And then we have this society that seems to have us play certain roles and have us look outside for validation and be concerned about image and wealth and status and security. Okay? So Rousseau is basically saying, look, naturally humans are free, individual, intelligent animals with compassion living in the woods. But society, once it's formed, makes us into softer, weaker beings who prize security, who want to be well-liked, who want to fit in, and we've lost touch with that basic primordial nature of who we are. So that's it pretty much on Rousseau. Now I'm going to erase this stuff on the board. Again, to repeat. First, on the upper corner is Jean Rousseau, State of Nature, Feral Children, Compassion, Individual, Security, Amour propre, Amour de soi, and then the question of what about it. Alright? And of course, obviously security versus freedom. Okay, so that was a discussion on Rousseau and how he takes society to be something that harms our human nature, something that's an imposition on our human nature, something that prevents us from living naturally in the wild like we are meant to do. However, an opposite view would be to say that, look, our human nature is fulfilled in society. It requires society. We become our best selves in society. To be human means to live in society. So as Rousseau would say to the question, who am I? Well, he would probably say something like, you're an intelligent animal who's meant to live in the woods. The second idea that we're going to talk about now would say, who am I? They'd say, no, you're supposed to be a member of society. Okay, so to get started on this, I think we should recall, first of all, when we talked about the idea of a cosmos, an ordered whole, we looked at, as one example of this, we looked at the idea of a ordered society. So if you think about an ordered society, it's one where you have people who are in charge, and you have lots of rules, some of which are explicit, like the laws of the land, some of which are kind of implicit rules of etiquette, rules about, how close do you stand to somebody when you talk next to them, what kind of clothes do you wear, stuff like that. Okay? And we also talked about the idea that living in a society sometimes helps us know our role, function, what we should do. Okay, so one of the first things that we should look at here is how a social role helps us define who we are. All right, so I'm going to put up this term social role. Now, this should be understood pretty broadly. Okay, so a social role can be any kind of role you play in any group. Now, it could be something like a parent, sibling, child, aunt or an uncle. Those are roles, tasks that we do in the society of a family. Now, in the society of a country, for example, there's other roles. There's the role of somebody who's like in the military, somebody who's in the government, somebody who's on the border patrol, all sorts of roles that are necessary for the functioning of this society. At church, we'll have certain roles. For example, that society, you'll have the role of somebody who is the priest, somebody who goes to the Mass, somebody who assists at the service, stuff like that. Now, what I mentioned earlier was that a social role helps us define who we are. Let me try to be more clear on this. If somebody assumes the social role of, say, being a father, it means he takes on a lot of responsibility, and he knows what's expected of him. He knows that he needs to get a job, a well-paying job to support his family. He knows he needs to get a job that will allow him time to spend with his family as well, so it's not too overwhelming. He knows he needs to be responsible for his children's education and their well-being. So he assumes the sort of tasks that can be good work, the sort of work that can help him be of assistance to other people. So part of what we're getting at is this idea that the social role can help us become the best version of ourselves. All right, that's probably the best way to say it. Social role helps us define ourselves and become the best of ourselves. Okay, so somebody who assumes the role of father, that might bring out the best qualities in that person, and he is the best version of himself because he's performed that social role. Somebody who joins the military, this might give his life structure, it might give his life purpose. He becomes somebody who's working for the defense of the country, for the betterment of the country, and he learns courage and self-sacrifice and team play and other virtues through this, and he becomes the best version of himself as well. Somebody who is a policeman helps to protect society, so this is a huge social role. He learns about his abilities. He develops the capacity to be of assistance to other people. He develops the capacity to be intelligent and learn about situations and how to solve crimes. And he becomes somebody who looks out for the welfare of others. This is again a situation where somebody can assume the social role and become the best version of himself. Okay? So here, contrary to what we saw with Rousseau, we see this idea that society can actually help us become the best of ourselves. Rousseau would say, society makes us weak, it makes us concerned about stupid stuff. This is saying, no, assuming this social role helps us to become the best version of ourselves. A second idea is that society gives us the values necessary to live well. Okay? So this is the idea of social values. Social values. Now, what do I mean by social values and why that's important? Okay. Well, imagine somebody who doesn't value anything. He doesn't think anything is worthwhile. This person would abuse others, he'd abuse himself, he'd abuse nature. It would be reminiscent perhaps of the Joker in The Dark Knight, as Alfred explains about him. He just wants to watch the world burn. Okay, he doesn't care about anything. Nothing's really valuable for him. He will do anything destructive, anything harmful, anything horrible. So to prevent that kind of nihilism, that sort of destruction, that kind of person who would just destroy whatever gets in his way, people need to learn values. Okay, they need to be able to value certain things, whether it's their family, whether it's things like education, whether it's they value virtues like courage, moderation, whether they learn to see the value of other people, whether they see the value in the natural world. So it's important, obviously, that people have a sense of values and they try to follow through with those values. They act according to what they think is valuable. So, for example, somebody who thinks other people are valuable is not going to end up using them as slaves, as toys, as any kind of instrument for his own pleasure. Okay, he's going to say, no, these people are valuable. I need to treat them well. I need to treat them with respect. I need to treat them with kindness. So again, it's very important that people learn values. Now, some people say that the only place to really learn values is through a society. We need other people to teach us about these values. We need other people to punish us when we fail to follow through with these values. We need other people to provide us with models and examples of how to live well according to these values. We need to learn what's right and what's wrong. So in order to have a proper moral character and a proper sense of values at all, there needs to be a society, whether it's a family, a church, a neighborhood, a school, a town, or a country that helps to form us to be people who try to follow right and wrong and have a good sense of values. If we didn't have a good sense of values, we'd end up being destructive, chaotic, agents of chaos, like the Joker in The Dark Knight. Therefore, to even be halfway decent human beings, we need some sort of society to help form us. Okay? So let me just reiterate this. Social role helps us define who we are and be the best version of ourselves. Social values is saying we need values in order to be halfway decent people at all. Values come from society, therefore we need a society in order to be halfway decent people at all. So according to both of these presentations, society is instrumental in helping us become decent humans and then developing into the best version of ourselves. Another thing to look at is that society, in a sense, helps us work for the greater good. Okay? So this is the idea of working for the greater good. I'll give you a couple examples of this. A friend of mine about 10 years ago visited Beijing, capital of China. And in Beijing, he visited Tiananmen Square, which is visited by millions and millions of people every year. And in the square, he saw somebody whose job it was to sit on a box and scrape up gum that people had dropped on the pavement. And that was her job. She did 9 to 5, maybe even more, maybe even 10, 12 hours a day. What my friend Mario said was that this woman was very seemingly content doing this. She seemed at peace doing it. You ask why? How is that possible? Well, she's working for the greater good. She's helping keep this square that's a huge part of the Chinese culture and the Chinese society. She's helping to keep that square clean. So she's performing her necessary task for the greater good. She's helping the whole society to function well. She's doing her particular work in a particular place for the sake of helping the greater good. So she's able to do what she seems to take as meaningful, important work for the sake of the greater good. So she's doing something that some people would say benefits her human nature. It's good for her to do it. You see something similar in Plato's Republic. Put this on the board as well. In Plato's, well, first of all, let me back up. Plato was a philosopher we looked at a couple weeks ago. He had this idea of forms. He had this idea of the myth of the cave. We looked at all of those things. Plato's most famous book was called The Republic. And The Republic is about Plato's ideas on the ideal city. What would the best city be like? Plato says that in this ideal best city, there are 3 classes of people. There are the rulers, there are the auxiliaries, and then there is basically the workers. And the ruler's job is to give the rule to the city and to lead it as best as possible. The auxiliary's job is to protect the city. They're the soldiers or the police force. And then the working caste are the ones who do the tasks like farming, carpentry, cleaning the streets, hunting, providing for the food, shelter, accommodations, everything you need in the city. What Plato contends is that people in any of these castes, the rulers, the auxiliaries, or the working caste, they're called to work for this greater good of keeping the whole city running well. And when they do their particular task, when the farmer farms well, when the carpenter makes houses well, when the auxiliary protects the city well, when the ruler rules the city well, when each person in his caste does his job well, they'll contribute to this greater good and be content doing it. This is what's good for them. Being part of this larger whole and working for it, okay? We talked last week about being part of a sports team. Well, this is taking that same understanding and saying, look, not just in the particular example of working on our playing on a sports team, but overall, in the general scheme of one's life. One's identity, one's main work, how one becomes the best version of oneself, is doing his proper function for the sake of the greater good. Okay? So again, what we looked at with Rousseau was this idea that society is corruptive, it's bad, and it hurts our human nature. This, what we've been looking at here, is to say no. These sort of things of a social role, having social values, working for the greater good, and Plato's Republic, they actually show us that being part of society, doing a social role, finding values in society, all of that participation in society is essential for us as human beings and is good for us as human beings. So this is the opposite of what we saw with Rousseau. Okay, now a couple more things I wanted to talk about. One contemporary mode of this being part of society presentation is perhaps this idea of being a productive member of society. So I'll write that. Right. Productive member of society. Now, this is the idea that in order for somebody to live well, you have to be a responsible adult. It's important to be a responsible adult, to grow up, to get a job, pay taxes, and to follow that social expectation. Don't be a bum. Don't reach off the system. Follow the pattern of finding steady employment, doing some good work in society, and contributing in that way. Okay? So this is just, with Plato's Republic, they had the caste system, the rulers, the auxiliaries, and the working caste. We don't have a caste system in the United States. We don't have this huge class separation like they did. We don't have this fifth-tiered system that Plato's talking about. But we still have sort of a basic sense that you'd be a productive member of society. This is, again, saying, look, contra Rousseau, against Rousseau, it's best and most natural for us to actually be part of society and be a productive member of society. All right? And that could be, that could, I think, play out in various ways. So according to this social presentation we can give, okay, when somebody is asked the question, who am I? They'll give answers like, well, I'm a policeman. That's the role I do in a society. Or I'm a father. That's the role I do in the society of a family. Or they'll say, I'm a priest. That's the role I do in the society of a church. Or I'm an American. That's my identity as a part of this country. So there are very quick, comprehensive answers that can be given to this question of who am I. Talk about your job, talk about your family relationships, talk about your national identity, etc. So we see, again, a point of contrast with Rousseau, right? Rousseau is saying, look, who am I? I'm an intelligent, compassionate animal that belongs in the wild. This social presentation is saying, no, who am I? I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm an employee of a company, I'm an American, I'm a taxpayer, etc. I'm defined by the roles I play in the various societies to which I belong. I'll say that again. I am defined by the roles I play in the various societies to which I belong. All right? Now, as we wrap this up, I think there's just several questions to kind of look at. First of all, is there more to us than our social roles? Is there more to us than our familial roles? Is there more to us than our identity as part of a country? Second set of questions. Are we akin to animals? Do we belong in nature, in the natural world? Is there something wild about us that needs to be expressed? Are we overly domesticated? Are we like 80-to-do animals? Or is Rousseau just crazy? So that's about it on this discussion of the self in society versus the self in nature. Okay? Rousseau is saying who we are is natural, intelligent animals. The other camp, which we've just looked at, is saying who we are is people living in a society, defined by that society, and being our best selves in that society.